Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the first Hanukkah in our continuing study of the period between the Testaments. We left off last time. We had seen Mattathias, the priest, leading a revolt, sort of an impromptu revolt there in the city of Modin, and they had to flee the city now. And they leave Modin, and Mattathias is going to die shortly thereafter. He's already old, and it could be that the rigors of running out into the wilderness are going to be a bit too much of for him. But he dies, and now not his oldest son, but his middle son, Judas, nicknamed Judas the Maccabee, Judas the Hammer, is going to be the new leader of the group, and Judas is going to take them to the region, not into the village itself, but to the into the region of what's called Japhna. And so this is a sort of a wild wilderness, forested area, a place where they can hide from the Seleucid troops, and a place where they can draw followers to themselves. Remember, not everybody who traveled with them, not everybody was on board with this revolt. There had been those Jews who had said, "You want us to worship different? Fine, we'll worship different." Um, and so some had already started that process, and some under threat of torture and of pressure had moved in that direction. But this is the faithful. Now he's relying on what we call guerrilla tactics. That is, instead of having his soldiers get up in line and march, they're hiding behind bushes and trees and things like that. They're not announcing their location. They're making surprise attacks, sometimes at early morning, sometimes the middle of the night, and that's quite effective. They're also having what we could think of as a militia system. That is, they're not a full-time army. They still have their farms, and when they're not fighting. They have to go back and reap the crops and thresh the grain, and it's life as usual for them. But now they have to do it under cover they're in hiding, so they have to be very careful so that they're not captured by the Seleucids. Apollonius, he's the governor of Samaria, marches now south to deal with this upstart Judah, and he's ambushed and he is killed. So again, the Maccabees, Judas has led them to victory, and this is starting to create a stir, and news is starting to get back to Syria. First Maccabees 3:13, when Seron, the commander of the Syrian army, heard that Judas had gathered a large company, including a body of faithful soldiers who stayed with him and went out to battle, he said, "I will make a name for myself and win honor in the kingdom. I will make war on Judas and his companions who scorn the king's command." Now, I'm not sure if he had permission or the go-ahead from Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV isn't going to be in the area, but now Seron does this. And so he marches south along the coast, all the way to Joppa. That's one of the coastal cities. Remember, that's the town where Peter was when the Lord gave him a vision about reaching out to the Gentiles many years later. From here, they move inland and up the pass of Beth Horon, narrow passes that take you up into the mountains. It's sort of rough going to go up to the mountains. And Judas attacks them in this narrow pass where their greater numbers really cannot be brought to bear. Even though Judas is outnumbered, he attacks on both front and to the side and behind, and it is a quick rout. So he has victory over Seron. In First Maccabees 3:24, they pursued them down the descent of Beth Horon to the plain. 800 of them fell, and the rest fled into the land of the Philistines. First Maccabees 3:27. When King Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered, and he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. He opened his coffers and gave a year's pay to his forces and ordered them to be ready for any need. Now that's going to be very expensive. He's going to be draining his coffers. Verse 30, he feared that he might not have such funds as he had had before for his expenses and for the gifts that he had used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. We get to verse 31. Then he determined to go to Persia. So he's going to leave here. He's going to leave his armies here. He's going to take some armies to Persia and collect the revenues from those regions and raise a large fund. That's where the money is. That's where the silver is. That's where he's headed. He left Lysias, a distinguished man of royal lineage, in charge of the king's affairs from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. So he's going to be going east of the Euphrates. He leaves Lysias in charge of everything west of the Euphrates. Verse 33, Lysias was also to take care of his son Antiochus. So that, this Antiochus the fourth who's going, and he's got a younger son, Antiochus the fifth, until he returned. So Lysias now has been given command of the troops and care of the son of Antiochus IV, and he has three generals, Ptolemy. It's not the same Ptolemy from Egypt, it's just a name that we've seen repeated because it's a Greek name, Nicanor and Gorgias. And they have a total of 40,000 troops. Now, some accounts say a bit less than that, so when you see differences, I'm not sure how they're counting, and 7,000 cavalry, and they're going to now descend on Judah in mass. Nicanor is leading them down the coast. They're going to fight a battle at Emmaus, and Judas had his camp at Mizpah, a famous location from the Old Testament. And the troops come down along the coast, and then they are going to take the Emmaus road. Remember how Jesus meets some disciples on the road to Emmaus? Now, when he does that, he's leaving Jerusalem and going down to Emmaus. They are coming up from the coast to Emmaus, and he takes the road to Emmaus, and there are troops, but there are also slavers with their funds, and they're planning on making a lot of money selling slaves. They're coming along to be able to sell the Jews into slavery, and they set up camp at Emmaus. Now, Gorgias has a different plan. I'm assuming they were operating with each one knowing what the other was doing. I don't know that for sure. But Gorgias plans a midnight raid on the camp of Judas because normally people don't fight at night. They don't have streetlights. They don't have lamps and flashlights. It's too easy to get lost. And so he's going to go up through the hills to their camp at Mizpah, and they get there and they find the camp empty because Judas has the same idea. He attacks Nicanor's camp at dawn and takes them all. Here's the description, verse 14, 1 Maccabees 4:14. The Gentiles were crushed and fled into the plain, and all those in the rear fell by the sword. They pursued them to Gazara and to the plains of Idumea, that's to the south, and to Azotus and Jamnia, that's also in the south, and 3,000 of them fell. So a great victory that Judas wins. We continue reading. A detachment appeared, and now they've stormed the camp. The people in the camp ran away. They are there setting fire to the camp, and they look up, and now there's a detachment coming out of the hills, and it's not a friendly detachment. This is Gorgias bringing his troops. They had sought to surprise Judah, but he wasn't there. And they saw that their army had been put to flight and that the Jews were burning the camp, for the smoke that was seen showed what had happened. When they perceived this, they were greatly frightened, and when they also saw the army of Judas drawn up in the plain, and now notice, if Judas hadn't been ready for this, he could have had his troops just, raiding the camp and stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, and they could have been taken by surprise. But instead, he's aware, and he has them trained where they drop everything and they drop in the plain for battle. And the Seleucids, Georgia's Seleucids, they all fled into the land of the Philistines. And so it's a double-barreled victory. Then Judas returned to plunder the camp, and they seized a great amount of gold and silver and cloth dyed blue and sea purple. Sea purple is like a really great sort of purple because that's a purple that comes from sea snails. It takes a lot of snails to get the purple. And great riches. Those of the foreigners who escaped went and reported to Lysias all that had happened. So there are survivors, they make it back. When he heard it, he was perplexed and discouraged, for things had not happened to Israel as he had intended, nor had they turned out as the king had ordered. The king, Antiochus IV, has given orders. He's not there. He's over in Persia, but he's given orders, and he expected them to be carried out. And Lysias so far has met with a miserable failure. Verse 28, but the next year he mustered 60,000 picked infantry and 5,000 cavalry to subdue them. They came into Idumea. Now, Idumea, sometimes we think about south of the Dead Sea, but at this point in history, Idumea actually has the southern part of what we think of normally as Judah. So he bypasses Jerusalem. He's going to, sort of do a reverse end run. And encamped at Beth Zur. He comes up to Hebron. That's the where the road takes you, and then up to Beth Zur. And Judas met them with 10,000 men. Now, Judas isn't in Jerusalem. He's at Mizpah. You say, why isn't he in Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem is still held by the Seleucids. They are under siege. There are Jews in Jerusalem, but the garrison in the city of David, just south of the temple, they're still holding out, and they're waiting for relief, and they're sending word, come and relieve us. We need supplies, or we have all of these soldiers that are surrounding us. And so they fight a battle at Beth Zur. It's not a defeat, but it's not necessarily a huge victory. And meanwhile, in the east, something happens to Antiochus IV. Um, Parthia had been, and we refer to them as Parthia, even though you say, well, weren't they Persians? Yes, they were, but they have a different ruling party. So that's why we call the ruling party Parthians, but they're still part of what we thought of formerly as Persians and the Persian Empire. Um, and he is repulsed at Persepolis, the city of the Persians. That's the city that Alexander the Great had burnt, and so it's still an important city. And he's repulsed, and he falls out of his chariot, and I'm not sure if he was dragged or exactly the nature of his injuries, but he's injured rather severely, and a few days later he dies. And so Lysias, who was trying to accomplish all this for Antiochus IV, suddenly his boss has died. He is overseeing the son of Antiochus IV, but he's just a kid. He's much too young to do anything. So Lysias breaks off and returns to Antioch because he thinks if any of Antiochus's other generals come back, they're going to end up taking over, and he'll be left out in the cold. And so he leaves Judah, and he goes back to Antioch just to make sure that everything is settled there. Now, I've been talking about the Acra. Here's a artist's conception of what that looks like. So you have the temple and the temple compound. Remember that the walls around it had been pulled down, and in its place, the Acra was a fortress just south of the Temple Mount. That direction is south. And the Seleucid soldiers are there. They're under siege, but they have big fortifications, and they are holding out, but they need to be relieved. Meanwhile, Judah now is able to come to Jerusalem. The Seleucid soldiers are still in the Acra, but he comes to the temple, and they are able to approach the temple. The Seleucids, they're able to shoot arrows at them, but they say, well, if we do that, they might shoot back. So let's sort of carry a moratorium on that. We read that there they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. The temple literally was a mess. It's still standing, but it's completely messed up and desecrated and desolated. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell them what to do with them. There's going to be a theme that sort of runs through Maccabees where there were no prophets anymore. And this isn't the only place it says that. We're going to see it again in chapter 9. And so, because there's no prophets, well, what do we do? Well, eventually, maybe one will come along, but not quite yet. Early in the morning, on the 25th day of the ninth month. Now, when you say ninth month, remember, their month didn't start in January. It started more like in the neighborhood of March. So count 9 months from there, and you're going to get to around December, which is why the Hanukkah celebration takes place in December. Notice, on the 25th day of the ninth month. That's not paganism. That's just when they got the temple free, which is in the month of Chislev in the 148th year. They rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. So they celebrated the dedication, and that word dedication, if you say it in Hebrew, you're saying Hanukkah. They celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings, and they offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. There's a delightful story. I don't think it's in any ancient text, but it sort of grew up and had a neat tradition that they didn't have enough oil to keep the golden lampstand in the temple lit for an entire 8 days, and they had to send for consecrated oil, and it took 8 days to get it there. But the oil supernaturally just kept burning and kept extending, and it's a great story. I'm not sure that it's true. It's not in the books of Maccabees. I don't think Josephus mentions it either.